Welcome back to another episode of Expedition 44 here with Matt and Ryan, and probably our favorite person to have on this show, Dr. John Walton. Thank you, Dr. Walton, for joining us today. We are so excited. We've been looking forward to this day for this interview. We've been on a pretty great road with you this year, kind of working through Lost World of Torah things. This latest book of yours has us beyond excited. This is very rare for me. I think most people know that I'm a speed reader. I pick up books and crush them in an hour or two and somehow retain information. But this one, I didn't do that with at any point. As soon as I got it from IVP in the mail, I took my time with it, and it took me about 3 days to read it the first time that I read it. Then I put it down and thought about it for a week or two, and then I revisited it and spent probably a week and a half on it. Now, I don't know that I've ever done that with another book before. In fact, I can't think of a book that I've spent more than really even a couple days on. And so this one comes to me, one, because personally it's a huge interest of mine, but second, because there's a lot of different thoughts, controversial material. Some people will know that this is sort of a reboot from you. So you've done Lost World of Torah that we've been reading for 15, 20 years now. It's all of those are very propositional. You have a very, very direct line that you're going after. This one actually is a little bit different than that. I might even call it like the FAQs of the Lost World of the Torah. And I loved what you've done with it. And I find myself picking it up and reading it over and over and over. And everybody's familiar with your work. I think if you're into theology, you've looked at John Walton's works for years and years and years. And I've said this more than once, but I think there's about three people that we're going to be reading in 100 years. And quite frankly, John, I think you're one of them with this set of works. And so give us a few minutes to just kind of talk about how this work is a little bit different than some of the other works that you've put out, and perhaps how it might come off from a different perspective than some of your other works. And I might even use the word, there might be a little bit of controversy surrounding it in some areas. So just spend a little bit more time than you usually do, kind of painting the picture, giving us a underlying idea of what it is that you've created here and what the pursuit of it has been.
Sure. Well, the structure of the other Lost World books is set up around propositions. So I take a controversial topic and I set up propositions of things that I would like to discuss and some of which I would like to assert. And then I discuss them and present evidence and draw my conclusions. And so I march through a series of propositions. And that's been characteristic of the Lost World series. In this book, I'm trying to update the conversation from the Lost World of Genesis books, particularly Lost World of Genesis 1 and Lost World of Adam and Eve. So that's thus the title, New Explorations in the Lost World of Genesis. In doing so, I didn't structure around propositions. I rather picked up some of the key propositions from those books and added a couple more topic areas that I dealt with in more detail in these. But really, the structure of the book is organized around FAQs, as you mentioned. So there are over 60 FAQs, and they're divided into the 8 sections of sort of the propositional focus of some of the other books. And so we have sections on Genesis 1 and temple and rest and garden and the trees and Adam and Eve. And so these are topics that were addressed previously. And now I'm trying to update what's going on in those areas, both in terms of insights and evidence that I've been confronted with, as well as the way my own mind continues to develop both in terms of communication of these ideas and sometimes in terms of my understanding and my conclusions. So
Yeah.
the main difference in structure is instead of being structured around propositions, it's structured around FAQs.
Great.
There's a couple of things that I know about John Walton that influence just about every post that I write. And I want to go over them and have you just kind of touch on these a little bit. The first one is reading faithfully. And you've got a book devoted to this, but I like how almost all of your work you kind of set the tone by the basis. And so reading faithfully, another one is cultural river, and then the third one would I that I would kind of always emphasize is saying that there was an intention to an original audience, and it can't mean something to us that it didn't mean to the original audience. And those are kind of the three things that I always give you tons of credit for and think is probably the most rich developments of what you have to offer to the theological world. Can you touch on those three things as they are important to all your works, but particularly this one?
But what holds all three of those together is the concept of biblical authority, which is the foundation of what I do. And that means that if the Bible has authority, then we are accountable to be faithful readers, faithful to its authority. So that's how that one works. That follows into cultural river because if we're going to be faithful to the intentions of the author, we have to recognize the underlying culture that's part of their communication, that's part of their thinking, and we have to recognize that, else we are inclined to impose foreign ideas onto the text that they never had.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
then that also reflects on the author's intention, because in my view, and I establish this in many of my writings, the authority of the text, it's God's authority, but it's vested in the human instruments that he chose to use. And therefore, my accountability to the text, my faithfulness to read it, my understanding of the cultural river is all tied into what I can discern as being the author's intentions. And of course, that involves not just culture and becoming aware of the culture in which Israel is situated, but it also involves a close reading of the biblical text. Here we're talking about language and literature, and making
Mm-hmm.
sure we attend to the literary devices and literary genres and make sure that we understand the words that are being used. And so the whole Lost World series has focused on that bringing together of close reading of the text along with recognition of its context, its cultural context, and seeing both those as instrumental to respecting the authority of the text to which I want to be faithful. There you are.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got 70 pages of methodology before you even get into the actual like content of the book. And I mean, I love that. I mean, each one of your
Mhm.
book has kind of had a section like that, but I mean, this one to denote 70 pages of a roughly 250 page book, I mean, that's significant and it communicates a lot of things. And another thing I always like to point out about you is you I would say more than most authors and theologians, you're really only, or I shouldn't say only, but very interested in what the text itself says, the exegetical takeaway. And I mean, it seems like you have some room for deductions, but you're really mostly interested in what does the text say and what can we take away from just simply that text without reading anything else into it. Is that accurate, or would you massage that a little
No,
bit?
absolutely, because one of the things I say quite often is that the strongest interpretation is the one with the strongest evidence. And therefore, I have to be a careful steward of the evidence. I have to be
Mhm.
attentive to the evidence. I have to try to limit myself to the evidence. Otherwise, the evidence can be corrupted by things that I bring in that don't belong there. So, I mean, we all have presuppositions, assumptions that we make, and we can't avoid it, and we don't want to avoid it. But in our process of interpretation, we have to be constantly reevaluating what
Yeah.
assumptions and presuppositions we have. Otherwise, they don't constitute evidence. they only constitute my preconceptions.
Yeah.
Um, my assumptions can become pivotal for some of my understanding of evidence. For instance, the assumption that the cultural backdrop of Israel is important to their understanding. That's an assumption. And some people don't like it, some people don't accept it. Um,
Hmm.
that's what comes into it because again, the strongest interpretation is the one with the strongest evidence. So I try to focus on the evidence. Of course, some
Yeah.
people will see some things as evidence that I would not accept as evidence. And
Hmm.
likewise the other way around. So
Yeah.
that's always the struggle that we have, but that's why we spend so much time on methodology.
Yeah.
In one of the books that I did with my son, the original draft had like 120 pages of methodology. And the publisher came back and said, "You can't do that. You're wearing your audience out before they can even get to the topic that you're dealing with." So we had to trim that back a bit.
I'm
That's
different than
good.
most people, but coming from a King's Commission perspective, I love this because I'm always trying to, we only have a short amount of time to accomplish a whole bunch of things that we're trying to get done. And so much of it is hermeneutics. And I've said what I'm trying to teach is, Matt and I have even gone back and forth. Like, do we even have a hermeneutics class? Because theoretically, I want to teach better hermeneutics in every single theology class that we do. It shouldn't just be one class or one introduction. I mean, every class needs to have a better approach. And so, I mean, you're speaking to my love language here of giving this 70 pages before you even get started. So I don't know if everybody appreciates that. I'm sure some people hate that, but I love it. I just
Yeah.
it's right where I think we need to be, and I very much have always appreciated that about your works, but particularly this one, you sort of went above and beyond there. So thank you for that.
Well,
Hmm.
conclusions have to be evaluated on the basis of the methodology, not on the
Yeah.
basis of whether this is what I'm most comfortable thinking, or this is what I've been
Right.
taught, or this is what people have always thought. They have to be evaluated on the basis of the methodology. So, in all the classes that I teach, whether I was teaching a survey of the Old Testament to freshmen, or whether I was teaching Hebrew exegesis of the book of Genesis to advanced graduate students, I always told them all every course I teach is a hermeneutics course.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I'm
Hmm.
not talking about it directly, which I do, but even if
Yeah.
I am not, we're modeling it, we're practicing it, and we have to observe what we're doing. We have to be intentional about it.
Yeah, for sure. So as we get into this book, like Ryan said, you start out with methodology, then you kind of jump into Genesis 1 in the first couple chapters there. Maybe give us a little overview of where we've been, like in the Lost World of Genesis 1, which was the first book of yours that I read and I absolutely loved, and how you talk really about function versus material, and then maybe some of the new things that you've brought in from what you had before.
Sure. So one of the first challenges I faced after Lost World of Genesis 1 was published was that I tried to discern this, what is going to be the contrasting term to material.
Hmm.
I've come to the conclusion that the text really wasn't focused on material making of objects. But what was it? How do you describe what it was interested in? And the best term I could come up with at that time was function. And so I used that as sort of a contrasting idea, functional ontology, and about functions meaning having a role and a purpose in an ordered system, and all of those things. Well, as the book was read and received, and people commented, both in very informal response, like when I was doing presentations, or in terms of serious academic reviews, that seemed to bring about a great deal of confusion. Lots of people were having trouble grasping what I meant by functions. I remember one review, I won't mention whose it was, that really took me to task on it and almost ridiculed me for how ridiculous an idea this was, and saying that they failed to understand what I meant by that. And there was a response on that post by a high school kid. He says, "I don't get why you don't understand this. It's perfectly clear." And he explained it. And I thought, all right, some people are getting it out there. But at any rate, So, so that was kind of a stumbling block to some people, and I felt like it was a word that took me in a positive direction for understanding, but I still was looking for something that would say it better, and I finally came up with one. And so you'll find in this book, and I've been doing this for a few years now, the focus has been more on order instead of function.
Hmm.
Of course, order was built into it from the start because function was a role and a purpose in an ordered system. But the idea that God is ordaining functions as opposed to God is ordering the cosmos, they come across a little bit differently. And
Yeah.
it turns out that that really works much better. I wish I'd thought of it from the start, but that works much better. It's not a change in perspective, it's just a change in terminology. My
Yeah.
thinking hasn't changed, but my ability to communicate my thinking has changed by using a word like order. And that becomes very prominent now in the treatments that I do.
Yeah, you use another analogy that you bring out in your new explorations there of the house versus home story. Would you mind
Yeah.
explaining that to us as well?
Sure.
I thought that was a great analogy.
Yeah. I had not thought of that one when I did Genesis 1, but it was incorporated in the Lost World of Adam and Eve in sort of the
Yep.
summary. And
Yep.
it's the idea of we can think about creation from different perspectives. When someone builds a house or has a house built, that's a very material process, and it has certain aspects to it: the foundation, the roof, the framing, the electricity, the plumbing, uh, and that's part of the house story. The making of a house would be a creation story of sorts. But then I bring out that likewise, the making of a home is a creation story and a very differently focused one.
Hmm.
When you make a home, you're thinking about how the furniture is arranged, what the use of rooms is going to be, what room does what, and the kids want to know which room is theirs, and all of these sorts of things. And so you can make a home which has to do with order and organization and use, rather than building of a house, which is a material process. So I just talked about how we can think of the place where we live as creation stories of either a house story or home story. Both are valid, both are legitimate, both can communicate a certain level of truth and accuracy, but they're different. And so that led me to suggest that with Genesis 1, we often want to read it as a house story, whereas I
Hmm.
think that the Israelites are more likely to be reading it as a home story. That was
Yeah.
actually suggested to me by a pastor friend. I'd given a presentation and I went down and sat down, and he was sitting next to me, and he raised this distinction between house and home. He said, "Isn't that really what you're talking about?" I said, "Yes, it is. Thank you." And
Yeah.
so he's footnoted in some of my
That's
my
great.
treatments of this.
Yeah, I thought that it's a perfect analogy for looking at the first creation story there and like what is the ancient perspective on it? Is it looking at this material creation or the purposefulness like behind it? Um, what do you think also you get into a little bit about like creation out of nothing? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I talked about that a little bit in the Genesis 1 book, but
Hmm.
here I spend a little more time on it. Of course,
Yeah.
creation out of nothing is asking a material question.
Hmm.
Know, was there pre-existent matter? Was all matter created by God, and or did He create out of nothing? And so that's an important question, but it's our question. It's a material question. And the point I make is that if this text is not focused on material origins, then creation out of nothing isn't a question that has any relevance or pertinence
Yeah.
to what the text is doing. And the text will not give an answer to it because it's not talking about the material cosmos.
Mm.
I like how, you get to the end of this and there's basically answers to frequently asked questions. In this first chapter, you kind of go through six of them and explain them. Why did you decide to go with that format? I don't think that's something a lot of people are necessarily used to in a book format as much as like a website or something like that. Can you talk through the thoughts behind it?
Sure. So since the books were first published, the first one beginning in 2009, 2010, I've been on the road, 15 years on the road. hundreds of public presentations in all kinds of contexts. And people ask the same sorts of questions. It's rare by this time that I get a new question.
Hmm.
There are questions people ask, and that to me indicates that these questions need to be addressed directly,
Yeah.
forthrightly, instead of just having the answers kind of woven into my conversation. These are questions people have even after I've given the presentations and even after I have these books, the previous books published. So I thought like that would be a very beneficial thing to do because people have these questions and they want to know how I would answer them. And they might not like my answer, or they might choose a different answer, or they might just be intrigued and curious. But I figured that was a way to communicate information. And
Hmm.
I did that just because that's sort of how things have been for the last 15 years. Whether it's in blog reviews or journal reviews or just the questions that people have. Sometimes when I've given a formal presentation or when I sit around a room with a bunch of pastors, and these are the questions they ask. So I thought that would be worthwhile. And I hope people will
Yeah.
find it productive.
My kids are always interested in Genesis. It's probably, I mean, I'm sure I've influenced that, always talking about it, but they're more interested in, early Genesis 1 through 11 than anything else in the Bible. And so I had this book, highly markered up, notes all over the place. And my oldest came home from college for a weekend, and he's always interested in what dad's reading. And when he sees Genesis or, Walton on it, he's really interested. So he picks up your book and he starts very carefully reading it, and he's a little bit of a speed reader like myself. And so he picks it up and he says, Dad, chapter 3 and chapter 4 are both titled the same thing, Genesis 1. Thinking that he had uncovered this big technical error in the book. I love that you've done this. Talk a little bit about, and it's a little bit of a form of the book, but it's unusual. So, kind of talk through why you go Genesis 1, and then you get into Cosmic Temple.
Mhm. So Genesis 1 has from the beginning of my work has had two very distinct issues. They're not totally unrelated, but they're distinct. And one is the question of order and function versus material, which is an important question, and we've just talked about that. But the other is about day seven and the concept of divine rest and cosmic
Yeah.
temple. And so those are very distinct issues, and I needed to treat them separately. They both come out of Genesis 1. Well, the right seventh day is technically in Genesis 2, 1 through
Do you?
3. I get it. Yeah. But it's still sort of that Genesis 1 referring to the 7-day creations. So
Mhm.
those are separate issues, and so I treated them in separate chapters, and they have different questions connected to them.
Yeah, so maybe let's get into a little bit of that Cosmic Temple stuff. What are some of your ideas behind that? I liked how you kind of reframed the way you talked about it, looking at
Yeah.
spreading order versus spreading sacred space. Maybe talked a little bit about that, and then also what that means for human priesthood.
Yes. So the idea of cosmic temple has been wildly successful. Many people have adopted it and done lots of different things with it. Some things that I would do and some things that I wouldn't do. But still, it's been a popular topic. And of course, I didn't make it up. I depended on previous research and whether that's John Levinson in his early work all the way back in the 60s, or a colleague of mine, John Lanzema, who did his whole dissertation on rest. He focused on New Testament, but had a whole chapter on ancient Near East that really was revolutionary in my thinking. So it's not like this was just my original idea. I was building on what others have done and trying to apply it specifically to Genesis. But others, while they accepted some of the aspects of all of that, also found reasons to object. And of course, I like to try to address those. Not
Yeah.
so much that I want to debate people or argue with them, but I can benefit from their insights and try to make adjustments. So one of the ideas that was brought up that I talk about in this book is one of my colleagues said, I don't know if temple works because temple is restriction. That is, temples have walls, and the presence of God is inside, and it's somewhat inaccessible or under certain conditions accessible. And so, if you talk about the whole cosmos as a temple, you've got a problem because there's no outside.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so now, of course, what was happening was he was extending my analogy, my metaphor, beyond what I was doing with it.
Yeah.
But it was still a legitimate claim. And
Yeah.
so in our conversations, I said, well, would it be any better in your mind if I said that the cosmos is sacred space? He says, oh, yeah, that works. So because that picked up the aspect that had relevance, and it
Hmm.
kind of bypassed the aspect that maybe was more difficult. But that's always the problem. Any metaphor can be extended beyond its usefulness, and so there was some conversation about all of that. So that's one of the changes I made in how I talked about it. The other objection came with regard to rest. And that is that as I deal with there, Genesis, the account of the seventh day, when it talks about God resting, it only talks about the ceasing aspect of that. It doesn't talk about the ruling aspect of that. That doesn't kind of come out until you start moving into Exodus and then other places. So I was challenged by people who said, you're reading too much into this here. There's no question those aspects eventually become part of the picture. But Genesis could have used that terminology and it doesn't. And so I was dealing with that and trying to, that's a matter of bringing more nuance and all of those into the question.
That's good.
I like your discussion of Sabbath too. You get into kind of all kinds of stuff going into seventh day and inauguration, literary chronology, kind of hit on that a little bit. I think that's one of the best parts about the book.
Well, people have regularly had the question, and I didn't deal with it very much in the initial things I wrote. Okay, if you say that God's rest is really equivalent to God's rule,
Right.
what does that tell us about what we're supposed to do on the Sabbath? And often I used to joke when I present this stuff, and at the end somebody would raise that question, and I would say, "Yeah, I wanted to. I didn't put that in my presentation because I knew somebody would ask it afterwards, and that way I get more time." So the the idea uh, that what we do with that, and the key that I bring out there is that we've generally thought of resting on the Sabbath as being a matter of imitating God. And that's problematic if, in light of my interpretation, that God's rest is God's rule, not his
Hmm.
relaxation. They say,
Hmm.
well, so we're not imitating God that way, so I don't get Sabbath anymore. And then I point out that here's the problem. We're thinking about it as imitation. It should be more participation. That is, we find our place in God's rule. We see ourselves as the beneficiaries of God's order bringing. We recognize Him as the order bringer and not as ourselves. And so participation uh, it becomes the main focus
Yeah.
rather than imitation.
Yeah, I thought that that part was great. As we move into Genesis 2, I liked quite a bit about your gardens and trees chapter there, but one of the things that like really stuck out to me is like the question of how should we consider the Garden of Eden? Is it to be thought of as most do as this pristine, paradise? What do you say to that?
Yeah. Um, so that's an assumption that we make, and it has a lot to do with how we understand the Garden of Eden, but it also sometimes is affected by how we think about new creation on the other end.
Hmm.
The theological way they say that is that protology and eschatology are mirror images, the beginning and the end. But that in itself is open to question and examination and at least to nuancing, even if we accept that at all. So we have to ask the question how the Old Testament readers in their cultural context would have understood this garden. Now, this is one of the places where my son challenged me. By now, your listeners are well aware that my son and I work together on books, and he challenges my thinking and helps me sharpen my thinking. And he raised the issue of Um, is Garden of Eden really a place where God has come to dwell in the human realm, which had been part of my initial presentations? Or is it where God has brought humans to dwell in the divine realm? And I hadn't even thought to ask that question.
Mm.
That's really an important thing about the work I try to try to force myself to ask questions that become important questions, but that I hadn't thought to ask before. And I'd never even considered that possibility. So I said, talk to me about it. So he started showing me all the places in the ancient Near East where you've got this concept of people coming into the divine realm and finding it an uncomfortable place, finding it a place where they just didn't really belong there and felt terrified or awestruck.
Mm.
And it's not only in the ancient Near East, it's in the Bible itself. You think about Isaiah's temple vision.
Yeah.
Oh,
Hmm.
man, I don't belong here.
Yeah.
Get me out of
Right.
here.
Oh, yeah.
That kind of thing. And actually, you can even see it in fiction. I was on a podcast for the Wade Center here on campus, which is about the Inklings, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien. I was
Mm.
talking about creation in C.S. Lewis's fiction, both in Narnia and in the Space Trilogy. And again, the idea when they encounter sacred space, it's wow, this is off limits. I don't belong here.
Yeah.
So at any rate, uh, then I said, but wait a second, if it's the divine realm, how come we've got the Tigris and Euphrates here? That certainly looks like human realm. Um,
Hmm.
and he said, think about it, Dad. Think about Greek mythology. The gods are on Mount Olympus. That's the
Hmm.
divine realm, but it's located in the terrestrial realm. Um, think about the Canaanite mythology. The god El is believed to dwell at the source of the rivers. It's in the
Hmm.
terrestrial world, but it's the divine realm. In Gilgamesh, where he finds the flood hero, he has
Yeah.
to get to this remote, largely inaccessible place, which is the divine realm. And
Mm.
so we find this commonly in the ancient world. And so he challenged me to think in sort of different terms here. And that ends up having some significant implications. Once we adopt that idea, some other dominoes start to fall.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I think it's a great discussion. I wrote an article based on your son's thoughts on this on liminal space and got into Rohr's ideas of that too. But I think it's a great conversation and it really makes you think differently about that space. It's interesting how those worlds still collide though. How you're still kind of going back of there's an element of, you know, earth slash humanity to it, and there's a realm of divinity. I think a lot of times people use a quote of, and Matt and I use this all the time, of like, we want to get back to Eden, but then to a certain extent I also question, like, how much should we want to get back to Eden, and how much is the picture actually in a recreated heaven and earth to take us past that initial creation of Eden.
Hmm.
Well, since New Heaven and Earth have elements of divine realm in them, we're not surprised that it shares some characteristics. The tree of
Yeah.
life, that belongs in the divine realm. And so it was in Eden as part of the divine realm, and it's in new heavens and new earth. So, in that sense, even though there are characteristics that coincide, they coincide by virtue of that element of the divine realm.
Mm-hmm.
So, I have a whole FAQ in the book, of course, on are we supposed to be going back to Eden? And
Right. Right.
and of course, I don't follow that thinking. I don't feel that the text portrays it in that way.
Yeah. So how are Adam and Eve influential in this conversation if you kind of take a J. Harvey Walton view on it?
Yeah. Well, one of the dominoes that falls is that I then had to revisit the idea of Adam and Eve as priests. Again, that was fairly popular idea in my original work in The Lost World of Genesis 1 and Adam and Eve, that the priestly idea expressed by the terms uh, of ruling, no, I'm sorry, serving and keeping,
Hmm.
Genesis 2:15. And lots of people liked it. And again, they built theology out of it. I liked it. It seemed to work. But of course, that was all dependent on the idea that this was God entering into the human realm and Eden, therefore, being like a temple in that way. If Eden is part of the divine realm, then it's more like the Holy of Holies, which bridges between the divine realm
Right.
and the human realm, rather than the temple as a whole. And therefore, the role of priests, therefore, becomes a little more difficult to sustain. And so I had to rethink the idea of Adam and Eve as priests. The terminology serve and keep likewise can be applied to wardens. And again, we used ancient Near Eastern material to talk about that role, but that doesn't figure very importantly there. But the idea that humans are brought into the divine realm, they wouldn't need to serve a priestly role if they're inhabiting the divine realm. And so that kind of knocked that domino, but actually it has some advantage to it. Previously, I had talked about Adam and Eve as representatives in two different ways. One, they were representative as archetypes in which they're all of us. But two, I had them representative as priests in which they are not all of us, but they are representations, right? Not everybody's a priest.
Right.
We can talk about Christians, never mind. But it's, it's that's a different sort of representation. And once I started evaluating this new concept about the divine realm, it became a little more obvious that I didn't need to have two levels of representation, which was not necessarily the cleanest way to go. But rather, if this is true that we're talking about the divine realm and we're not talking about humanity as priests, then the representation in these chapters is purely and solely archetypal
Hmm.
representation. That is, now throughout the whole, they are us, we are them. What they are, we are. What they do, we do. And so that makes it, you know, um, the idea, the cleanest conception has more logic to it, and so that's one of the things that I ended up changing in my viewpoint.
Yeah, cool. Um, what about one thing I found interesting in that chapter was your conversations on humans created immortal and created perfect. Those are often things that come up in evangelical theology quite a bit of you have an eternal soul or this Adam and Eve were perfect and fell. What are some of your thoughts on that that you deal with in the chapter?
Sure, our whole concept of the fall, uh, fall is just a shortcut word, and it's
Hmm.
a fall from grace.
Hmm.
And to understand a fall from grace, you have to assume an initial condition of grace. And that's highly theological. It's an intriguing theological concept, but it's very difficult to substantiate that in the book of Genesis, that they are kind of in a state of grace of some sort. And that gets into the question of perfection. That is, once we start talking about order, we understand that the entire cosmos is not ordered. Order is brought into the cosmos, it's established, but God is going to continue bringing order. And the whole idea of people being in the image of God is that as image bearers, they are order bringers. And therefore,
Hmm.
the order bringing process is supposed to continue. As a result, it's not being presented as kind of a morally perfect world or a physically perfect world. It's an ordered world. And so I raise questions about that concept of perfection. Mortality, of course, is a different issue. We there I go to the statement in 2:7 about Adam being formed from dust. Of course, Adam is just a word for humanity, and so this is talking about humanity. Um, and we often take it somehow scientifically,
Mhm.
materially,
Yep.
that somehow God's sitting there kneeling in the dirt, crafting a human being and breathing into it life, and then that becomes the first human. And so we've given it a scientific origins of humanity perspective. And what I raised there is the very important observation from the Hebrew text that the preposition from is not there. That is, formed humanity from the dust or of the dust. There's no preposition there. And so I present the idea that it doesn't even, this is not about composition, biological or chemical or anything of the sort. This is about identity. That is, the Lord God formed humanity, dust of the earth. That's what we are. And that's a metaphor. It's not
Hmm.
biology, it's a
Yeah.
metaphor for mortality. And of course, that would mean that God created people mortal.
Hmm.
And that knocks at the door of some very strongly held views about humanity and our
Yep.
origins.
Yep. It does. Yeah. It also gets into um, kind of the talking about clothing of flesh and all of that type of stuff. Also, speak
Yeah.
to us maybe a little bit about that.
About the clothing,
Yeah,
we're
the
talking
clothing of
clothes.
flesh. Like what is that? There's a lot of strange ideas about out there about like what did it mean that God like clothed them in about their nakedness and clothing them in flesh.
Well, one of the things that I adopted from my son's doctoral dissertation, once we have order as kind of the framing focus of the text, um, we don't just talk about it in Genesis 1, God creating
Mhm.
by bringing order. We talk about it in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 about humans seeking order. Again, as image bearers, we're order bringers, and order was lacking on several occasions in Genesis 2. There was no agriculture, um, and it's not good for humans to be alone. These
Mm,
are deficiencies that the text is resolving, but they all talk about how order is sought and how order is found and where order is found. And one of those deficiencies is actually in 225 that they were naked and unashamed. That's the typical kind of um, translation.
yeah.
My son raised the alternative possibility, which I think is more accurate. They were indecent and shameless. Uh, and that brings out that somehow this is not how glorious they were in their light clothed nudity or something.
Yeah.
It's rather another deficiency. Um, Throughout the ancient Near East and throughout the Bible, nakedness is a negative. It's
Mm,
uncivilized. It's barbaric. And so this is a deficiency and it needs to be resolved. I'm sorry, the way that it is resolved is by clothing them. And so they try to bring order for themselves by recognizing that now they need to be more civilized and they try to hide themselves with the fig leaves, but God goes the next step and clothes them. And that's an act that brings order through
mm,
civilization. But the point of the biblical text is that all of these human attempts to bring order for themselves are inadequate. They're not the ultimate um, solution to what is order establishing.
That's good. All right, we're to chapter 7. We get to Genesis 3, and I'll come back to what I was sort of joking about. There's chapter 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. So the first part of your Genesis 3 is entitled The Fall. And it appears that you might have changed some viewpoints from your earlier thoughts on the fall, but there's so much here, and I'd like to, just kind of hand it over to you and give you a significant amount of time to kind of, work through this. There's so much material here. You've had some good scholars contribute to some of your works. I remember early N.T. Wright with his views on Paul's making some connections in the lost world of Adam and Eve. And you've had some other people kind of contribute over the years, but I think your take on the fall would be different than most people's take on the fall, and perhaps those views have evolved a little bit, especially with views on serpent, or you've already hinted on death a little bit. Kind of do this whole chapter is very interesting, and be quite honest, I'm still working through a lot of it. I agree with a great a great your views always influence what I think of the Bible. Not that it matters, but it always influences those things. I'm not sure I take every view or come to exactly where you're at on it, but the fall is someplace right now that like I'm still working through kind of a new version of this. So as you know, I kind of go back to seeing the fall as more of a dual fall. You don't really take that perspective. I'd like to really talk through a lot of this and kind of how you've gotten there and how it all makes sense, formulates together, what's based on what else, what lens we're talking about, what are some of the things influenced by the whole conversation.
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of our talk today, one of the constant challenges is to identify our presuppositions, recognize them as presuppositions, and
Yeah.
evaluate as to whether they are valid presuppositions that we should be holding. And we have all kinds of blind presuppositions, things that
Yeah.
we assume without even realizing that they are impacting the way that we think and interpret. And so it's very easy to read Genesis 3 with Paul strongly in our minds.
Mhm.
Yep.
And at the one hand, when you're doing theology, that certainly could have some advantages. But if I'm trying to understand the message of Genesis in the eyes of the author of Genesis, and in terms of what his audience would have understood, I have to momentarily put Paul to the side and try to see, okay, what is it that actually comes up in Genesis 3? I've already mentioned the fact that, of course, Genesis 3 doesn't refer to it as a fall. They wouldn't see there as a state of grace.
Yeah.
But even Paul doesn't use the term fall and talk about that concept. That develops pretty soon in church history, but Paul doesn't
Yeah.
use that kind of terminology. But it goes even further than that. And I was challenged to ask the question, does Genesis 3 talk about sin? Is that what it's doing? Is that what its focus is? Is it really trying to tell you how sin began? And
Right.
of course, since we read through Paul, we don't even ask that question. And oh, it
Mhm.
must be here somewhere. Oh well, oh no, oh well, no. And so we are suddenly confronted with evidence. Now, some people would say, oh, it's implied. Well, wait. Okay, the implications are often in the mind of the reader, and we have to ask the question, is it really self-evident or crystal clear that this is what the narrative of Genesis is focusing on? The word sin's not used until Genesis 4, and there it's referring
Yep.
to Cain's anticipated murder of his brother. It certainly shows up as an important issue in the flood narratives, both in chapter 6 and chapter 8. It doesn't use the word there, but it talks about violence and all of these issues, which we clearly identify as sinful behavior. But again, we have to pay attention to the words that are used if we want to understand the focus that the author is taking. And again, I'm committed to trying to track with the author, read through the author's lenses, read like an Israelite, not read like a Christian, not read like a Greco Roman, not read like a theologian, but to read like an Israelite. And so that forces me to a much more narrow demand of the text. And when you look at it that way, if order is a prominent theme, which I believe can be established almost beyond
Yeah.
doubt,
Yep.
we realize easily that the knowledge of good and evil is an order tree. It's a wisdom tree.
Yep.
It's the good and evil there are not moral terms; they're order terms. It's a knowledge of what brings order and what doesn't. And of course, that's a logical thing to be in divine world because God is the order bringer, and He has humans as His apprentices with the very task of bringing order, so that a tree would be reflecting that significance, and that it poses the question, are they going to be content as apprentices, or are they going to want to go out on their own? And remember, I'm saying they, but it's we. Are we
Mhm.
content as apprentices, or are we more determined to go out on our own? And so the tree becomes the means by which they make the latter decision. They want to be autonomous order bringers, not so much focused on God's order, but on their own. And that autonomous order bringers is what characterizes chapter 3 there. In that sense, it's not so much that now they have disobeyed a command and sinned. Rather, they have failed to heed a warning, and they have taken what is God's prerogative on themselves. Now, you could say, well, that's sinful. Well, yes, I understand that. But is that the focus that the text is taking? They have decided to be self focused and self dependent order bringers. And that doesn't necessarily result in evil, but it can.
Right.
After all, sometimes as people try to bring order, that may also coincide with God's order.
Hmm.
Okay? But it opens up the possibility that you're going to follow your own way, and that's what we all do. All we like sheep have gone astray. Each one of us has turned to his own way. It's what we all do. We do it all the time. And that's how we reflect this idea that we are sinners. But that's language that we bring into it theologically.
Yeah.
So that gives a little different focus on the passage. They have failed to heed the warning, and therefore they're going to suffer the consequences. The consequence at one level is that now they're going to be subject to death. And of course, that's what Paul picks up in Romans 5 as well. They're going to be subject to death. That's a consequence. But the text doesn't really focus on that consequence. If you notice, chapter 3 doesn't say, and now you're going to die. That was
Right.
in the warning. But now instead, it talks to them about how they are going to get along as order bringers. Are they going to have challenges? Well, yes. Childbearing, food growing, these are challenges. They're order bringing, order challenging, order threatening situations, but they've taken this task on themselves. And so again, we find that we wouldn't call Genesis 3 15 through 19 a curse. The ground is cursed, the serpent's
Right.
cursed, but people are not cursed. These are
Hmm.
just the consequences of what they've chosen to do. So I wouldn't, again, prompted by my son on this case, I wouldn't say that Genesis wants to present that as punishment. They've been given a warning. This is what's going to happen. And they fail to heed it and they suffer the consequences. When you tell a child, don't touch the hot stove, that's not a command. It might be you would command them, but that's not the point. It's
Hmm.
a warning that such behavior would have consequences. And if the child touches the hot stove and burns their hand, it's not the stove punishing them, and it's not you punishing them. They've simply suffered the consequences, which is not the same as a punishment. Now, again, these are all questions that people don't typically ask, and that I, for a long time, didn't ask. But once they're asked, then we have to try to address them.
Hmm. Yeah, it was great chapter. I mean that's a fresh way to look at that text there. As you go throughout Genesis 3 also, um, you get to Genesis 3:16 and the whole thing with the some call it the proto-evangelion or whatever the the gospel there. Should we view this like what's going on there? Should we view it as messianic? Yeah, what's going on in Genesis 3:16?
Okay, your listeners are already correcting you. It's 3:15.
Sorry,
Okay, so
3:15. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
yeah, all your alert readers are already
Yeah.
going, okay. So
Yeah. Three
so
sixteens after that.
yeah,
Yeah.
3:16 is also intriguing. But
Yeah,
so
intriguing. Sorry.
3:15,
Both of those.
um, framing it the way I have, that they've chosen order on their own. It's very interesting, of course, that in ancient Near Eastern accounts like Enuma Elish, the gods have to overcome the chaos creature in order to bring order, to
Hmm.
create. And so it's the battle with the chaos creatures that constitutes a creation narrative. And of course, everyone's noticed that's totally absent in Genesis 1. God's
Mm.
not
Yeah.
battling chaos creatures. He doesn't have to go through conflict in order to create. But here we have in Genesis 3 I've suggested, and I did before, that the serpent is a chaos creature. But here in 315, since people have chosen to be the order bringers autonomously, God has said, well, when you do that, you've taken the battle on yourselves. That is, the battle against chaos is going to be your battle. And you chose that. So you want it to be your own autonomous order bringers. That means you're going to have to battle non order. That's, of course, how I talk about chaos, non order. And so 315 talks about this enmity now, this conflict that's going to be theirs, generation to generation. Yourself and your seed, the serpent, chaos, non-order, and its seed, non-order in all of its diversity as it challenges our survival and attempts to bring order. You have brought this on yourselves. And so this conflict exists generation to generation, and you'll be constantly, perpetually exchanging potentially mortal blows. That is, the crushing of the head is a potentially mortal blow to a serpent. The biting of the heel is a potentially mortal blow to a human being. The same verb is used for both of them.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so my point here, and it's one I've made for a long time, this verse doesn't tell you who wins. And
Right.
therefore it can't be taken as a promise of victory because it doesn't tell you who wins. The whole idea of the verse is the transfer of the conflict. Since they have transferred the responsibility for order, they have transferred the conflict. And that's precisely what God says. Here are the consequences of what you have done. You've made this choice. And so you've got the conflict. And then, of course, that makes perfect sense with what comes after, that that conflict is going to be readily evident in some of the most basic aspects of life, childbearing and food growing.
Hmm.
And so he talks about the ways that they will be fighting against non-order in this struggle that they've taken on themselves.
It's good.
So I guess honing in on this, I'm looking at, your view of the fall, and I totally agree with. I love your section where, you ask some key questions of how did Satan get access to the Garden of Eden, talking about traditional viewpoints. Does this mean that evil already existed before the fall? How were Adam and Eve expected to resist temptation if they were forbidden to partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? These are all great questions, kind of looking at the traditional view that you have to figure out in your view. Those things can't kind of coexist in good theology, I would say. Um, so you're kind of proportioning the serpent as a chaos creature, neither good nor bad. And I think I'm on page 187. Not that you need to go there, but I'm just going to kind of quote what you say here in a short quote. It says, "The questions posed and statements made by the serpent are intentionally provocative in that they prompt some rethinking. The serpent never suggests that they should eat the fruit, though by questioning what reasons they might have for not doing so, it leads them in that direction. In the Genesis account, the serpent is not a central character, but a bit player who serves in the role of the catalyst. It should not be identified as a tempter, nor should be it considered inherently evil, chaos creatures, or are amoral." And so, are we understanding correctly when I'm looking at this that you would just simply put the serpent as a chaos creation, not good, not bad, and that what the serpent was doing was just asking questions, not necessarily, uh, a picture of evil or tempting or steering them to go that route. That was just a decision that then Adam and Eve made on their own doing, and the serpent just kind of slithers away, never to be seen again.
uh, as a chaos creature who'd be representative of the non-ordered world. Again, whether we call non-order chaos or non-order, I prefer the latter, but others
Yeah,
more comfortable with. But
sure.
but yeah, it just plays that role. It's interesting. I was just thinking, we we often talk about someone as playing the role of the devil's advocate, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
And sometimes we use that, at least I've used it um, to talk about a student who's very thoughtful and provocative and will raise challenging questions just because it's a good conversation to have, not because he or she necessarily disagrees with me or wants to build another case, but rather, they play devil's advocate. Well, what if we think this way, or what if we think that way? Now, of course, devil's advocate is um, dual-edged here because
Hmm.
lots of people think that the serpent actually represents the devil or is embodied by the devil or all of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say that, but I would say he is playing the role that we often assign to devil's advocate. After all, when a
Yeah.
student asks that question, I'm not saying they're possessed by Satan. I'm saying
Right.
rather they're kind of raising alternative positions or asking for further defense.
And
And
can you
that's
call
not
that a challenger or not?
Hmm.
it's it challenges the thinking, yes, but not necessarily with the idea that they're going to try to shoot me down or undermine what I say. It's just that idea of kind of pushing me to define things further, and that's the provocateur kind of role. So I wouldn't have no hesitations of thinking about the serpent playing the role of devil's advocate in that English way of
Hmm.
speaking,
Yeah.
which is, again, not something that's inherently evil or undermining, just saying, think about this more. What's going on that pushes us, pushed, okay, in the context of Adam and Eve, to consider alternatives that they hadn't considered before?
So just to be clear, you see this as the fall in Adam and Eve, but not necessarily in the traditional sense of original sin, but you don't necessarily see it as any kind of reference for the fall of spiritual beings at that point.
No, I don't see the Bible talking about the fall of spiritual beings anywhere. So I'm not
Yeah.
inclined to that. I know that's something that we have disagreements on, and that's fine.
Well, I don't know that we have heavy disagreements on that. I mean, I love this conversation. I think it's a great.
Uh,
Hmm.
I'll talk for the next hour on this one if you want to, but yeah.
but but likewise, I wouldn't call it a fall of Adam and Eve. That is, they are us, we are them. This is the human characteristic that we want to bring order for ourselves. We always make this choice. So we don't
Hmm.
have to talk about, well, they goofed up and we're stuck with their mess. Or how did we inherit this? Or how's it passed on? Those are just not the right questions.
Right,
For
right.
us, that's the archetype idea. And we are
Hmm.
them. What they did, we do. And so, in that sense, this is just talking about humanity and what we are and how we work and think. And so, in that sense, I don't see it as, well, there's a before and an after here. No, there's one way to
Hmm.
conduct yourself, that is being totally in apprenticeship to God in his ways. And there's the other way, which is the human way, which is
Hmm.
what we all do, seek to go out in our own autonomy.
Yeah.
And it's just describing that nature. That's not evil, although it can easily lead to evil. So that addresses the question of, well, did God create people evil? No, he created them with the ability to choose.
Hmm.
And when they
Hmm.
choose, they can choose evil. That doesn't mean God creates evil. Now, again, I'm not a philosopher and I get out of my depth really quickly in that conversation.
Yeah.
But just kind of trying to position our
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah.
So you've labeled your chapter the fall and not to try to nail you down to anything here, but then do you actually not agree that the title should be the fall?
No, it shouldn't be. I labeled it that way because that's how people think about it.
Yeah.
Just want to be clear there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Cool. What are your thoughts on how like and this is more New Testament, Paul and Romans 5 connect to this?
yeah. Well, there's a whole excursus on that
Yep.
in the book, of course, written by my son. I got him to write
Mhm.
5 excurses because I wanted him to have his own voice as he talked about these things.
Yep.
Um, and we have to understand the conversation that Paul's having. It's a conversation that's relative to not only his Greco-Roman world, but to his Christian world. And therefore, he's trying to bring um, maybe as little as anecdotal material from the well-known literature of Judaism into the conversation. We have to figure out what Paul's doing in his books and how he's doing it and how he's trying to use Adam and Eve. And that's the big discussion there. I think that we overestimate what Paul is doing there. Um, but Paul is in his own world of conversation. When we think about that world, I mean, what was Paul was trained as a Pharisee. What would
Yeah.
have um, been the framework of Pharisaical training in his day? Well, we can look at some of the literature that's around. He would have been very familiar with the Book of Jubilees. It was written in the
Yep.
second century BC, and it was fundamental for Jewish thinking and has a lot to say about Adam and Eve that's not coming from Genesis.
Yep.
And so the Book of Jubilees is very familiar
Yeah.
to him. He's a contemporary with Philo. Philo is a philosopher, a Jewish philosopher in Alexandria. Paul's not in Alexandria, but we know that Alexandrian thinking has spread into the larger Roman world. We've got Apollos, and Philo's philosophy is allegorical in nature. And Paul shows some reflection of being aware of Philo's thinking. And then we also have Josephus, the Jewish historian, who overlaps with Paul, although he's 20 or 30 years younger than Paul. But he overlaps with Paul. And when Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews reflects on how Jewish people of his time, which is also Paul's time, are thinking about Adam and Eve, we see that there's a whole universe out there of thinking
Hmm.
between Jubilees and Philo and Josephus. And Josephus was also trained as a Pharisee. So we get a very much
Yep.
elaborated picture of all the things that are in Paul's cultural mind about Adam and the things that he will draw from. And so I think we have to see Paul as engaging in conversations in his Jewish world, in his Roman world, in his Christian world. And he's
Yep.
redeploying material from Genesis that's affected by those conversations and affected by that material and bringing them into his conversations of what points he is trying to make, which are not always the points that we are trying to make from Paul. So, yeah, it gets very
Hmm.
complicated.
It does. Yeah. Well, thanks. This has
This
been
is
a
this is
awesome conversation. Yeah.
yeah, before we move away from that, Matt, I after you kind of in your book, I'm on page 197 if anybody's following along. So 195 says it's the J. Harvey Walton excerpt. What is Paul's interest in Adam in Romans 5? And then right after that, it kind of switches back to your voice in this. And it says, my argument does not concern this interpretive and theological direction, but is only trying to address what issues are being discussed in the context of Genesis. If Genesis is not discussing sin and its origin, what is it discussing? And then you kind of go on to portray. And so from your view then, going off of this, I guess the question is what is the role of Genesis 3? What are our exegetical takeaways of what do we get from Genesis 3?
In Genesis 3, we learn about who we are as humans because it's archetypal. And
Yep.
as humans, we are seeking order. We are trying to establish order, but we want to establish order our way for our own benefits, whether human benefits or my own personal benefits. And we see this has been always characteristic of the human condition. So this is giving us insight into who we are as human beings, who are seeking order and are finding that all of our attempts to bring order, whether through agriculture or civilization or community or city building, all of our attempts to bring order are inadequate. Just like in Ecclesiastes, where he points out that all our attempts to figure out meaning in life are inadequate. Not that they're total failures, but they're inadequate for doing it. And so, what we learn in these early chapters of Genesis that as we all follow our natural intention to try to bring order, we keep bumping into brick walls. We find out that they have their limitations, in Ecclesiastes' view, and then you die. It's not adequate. And Genesis 1 through 11, and this is the focus of my son's dissertation, Genesis 1 through 11 is marching us through all of those who are the standard suspects? What are the ways that we in the ancient world were seeking order? Because lots of those are the same ways that we seek order. And the whole point of Genesis is as it goes through all of those and one by one dismisses them. For instance, it's not enough to be like God, right? That's inadequate to bring order because we
Yeah.
still seek order our own way. And when you get after you march through all of those options in Genesis 1 through 11, it dumps you into Genesis 12, where it gives God's option. That is, the way to find order is in the covenant, which means that it's found in relationship with God. And so all of 1 through
I
11 is
love
a
that.
setup for the
That's so
covenant.
key. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
And it,
put that one on replay for about 30 seconds when I edit this video. Yeah.
it pulls all of 1 through 11 together with continuity instead of just kind of blurbing certain uh, events. It's saying these are all part of the same human attempt to bring order, and
Yeah.
they're all inadequate. But God has a solution to that. God's ultimate instrument for order is the covenant. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why Genesis 1 through 11 serves as a great introduction to the rest of Genesis. It's why
Yeah.
Genesis 1 through 3 sets it up because God is the order bringer. And humans are supposed to be working toward order that's natural for them to do so. But if they want to do it themselves, they find frustration. And so God has a solution, and that's what the covenant represents.
Does Jay Harvey's dissertation get into that covenant language that you were just talking through?
Yes, yeah, that's how he portrays 1 through 11 as well.
And is it out yet for anybody to read yet, or is that still in the
It's
works?
not published, but it is available online, and I've got
Okay.
the URL in the footnotes of the book.
Okay.
Cool. Well, any
I think we can leave that one
yeah,
alone. As tempted as I am
yeah,
to keep having this
keep going.
conversation all day, I'm going to leave it alone. Maybe I'll get you into that conversation all day tomorrow. But from there, we kind of go into Adam and Eve, and the raging question, kind of tied in with the original sin is: are they punished for their sin?
And again, I'm more inclined now to say consequences and punishment are not the same thing.
Hmm.
And that what we see in Genesis, I think, are consequences.
Yep.
And, you know, again, people don't always see the distinction between them. I talked about the hot stove as an example. Another one
Right.
is so, say your teenager has a car accident and wrecks the family car. Okay, you could have punishment where you say, okay, you're grounded. That was stupid and it was harmful, and you're punished. You're grounded. That's punishment. Consequences would be, your insurance costs are going to go up, and you can't afford it, and we can't afford it. So your driving privileges are going to be non-existent. That's not a punishment. That's a consequence.
Hmm.
I
And
was hesitant to even ask because this seems pretty basic. Matt and I did a whole thing on original sin, and we just drove this whole idea into the ground. But again, like I had to coerce you into agreeing with us on that one. So I just wanted to get that in there. Um, Theodicy, the problem of evil, Genesis 3. Where do we go with that?
I don't think Genesis 3 is a theodicy either on the cosmic realm or in the human realm. It's not trying to explain the origin or existence of evil. It's indicating rather that we had been given a role and a choice from the beginning, and we have always, historically, from the beginning till now, made the choices that are selfish.
Yeah.
Good. Well, as we kind of wrap up our time here, any closing thoughts that you have that we didn't cover, I guess, in this conversation, and what do you want people to like really take away from this book?
It's really what I always want them to take away from my books. Be willing to think new thoughts. Be willing to ask new questions. Be willing to consider nuances. Be willing to look at evidence. That's always what drives what I do. And that's what I
Yeah.
would want people to do. Some of these questions are really going to drive them crazy. They're
Hmm.
going to to make them explode with "you can't do that" or uh, fine, think, think, study. Again, figure out what presuppositions you're holding and whether you really should hold them or not. And uh, the way that we need to rely on the evidence.
One of the things I've always liked about you the most is that your mind is continually being, I would say, unbiased based on simply scripture itself. What's the best understanding of it? And I don't know, do you still have that plaque in your office that said something like, give I can't quote it. I don't remember what it's. I've only been in your office twice, I think, but I don't remember exactly what it said.
It
Tell us about that for a second.
says, Lord, give me this day my daily opinion and forgive me the one I had yesterday.
That's good. That's good. I like that one.
That's good.
Kind of a good way to sum up this conversation, as I think some readers aren't necessarily going to follow you close enough to see the places where you've slightly changed, whether it be Jay Harvey's influence or somebody else's influence along the way or something like that. But my favorite thing about this book is that it's somebody who I think in our world is I started this conversation saying one of the three people out there I think that we're going to be reading in 100 years from now, and influenced by that. And what you're showing us is that there's room for changes, perspectives in theology to be influential. And I've always said, like, if you don't have that and you're into theology, you're missing something very foundational.
Mhm.
Mm.
Uh, I even addressed it a bit in this book about how important it is to retain the willingness and ability to change your mind. If
Yeah,
it's really true that the strongest interpretation is the one with the strongest evidence, we have to always be ready to consider new evidence that might be stronger than what we had before.
yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely.
For sure. Well, that's a good note to end on. Dr. Walton, we're so thankful for you and for you giving us your time over these like 8 episodes or so that you've come on with. We've really appreciated, again, your time, the conversation, um, all that you have put into these books. I know that they're been a blessing to Ryan and I and our growth and our faith. And I would say they're a blessing to the church as well. So thank you for challenging us in our hermeneutics, challenging us in our interpretation of the Bible, and leading us to a more faithful reading of Scripture.
Thanks. We always hope for the best and pray that God will protect us from wrong directions and focus us toward things that will be growing the church.
Yep. Amen. Well, may God bless you and keep you. Thanks for coming on.